I'll welcome everyone. So welcome to this month's our user group for Salt Lake City. This is our March meeting, and we are so glad that you are all here. My name is Julia Silgi, and I'm one of the organizers, along with Andrew and Mark. And we are so glad to have you all here. I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat for you as we get started. First, I'm going to drop a link to our meetup group, which I'm sure is how you found us, but just in case you would like a reminder there, you can always find us on our events there. We have been having some great talks and events this spring, and we have some more ahead of us. I encourage you to look at the next couple months. Next month in April, I'm excited about our talk. I'm not a neutral person on to speak about that next month, because it is about the actual project that I work on, tidy models, but it's about stacks, an R package called Stacks, which is about ensembling of models. So it's like a modeling and machine learning talk. I think it'll be really interesting and great. So I encourage you to come to that. The other thing I want to drop here is a link to the code of conduct that we use in this. So this is a virtual space, a virtual meeting, but just as if we were in person, we want to treat each other as professionals and with respect. And so those of us who are organizers are here to make sure that that happens. So we probably encourage you to stay muted while our speaker is talking, and you can type any questions that you have into the chat. You can also use that raise hand feature if you feel like it's not going to work for you to type in your question. Kenneth, our speaker, has said that like he definitely wants us to be able to interact and say what he is if he is interested in if you're interested in what he's saying and have something to ask about, that he wants to interact with us in that way. So please go ahead and do that. I am super interested in this talk that we have right now, we're about to hear, because I think it's going to be so practical, so helpful just for the everyday work that we do. I actually work for the company RStudio, which makes the IDE that so many of us use in our daily lives. But whenever I hear a talk about like how to use some part of the IDE, there's a lot of it that I'm like, oh yeah, like that's a good reminder, or like I knew how to do that. But there's always some little thing that I'm like, oh gosh, I should start doing that right away, and I'm not doing that. So I think that's probably going to happen for a lot of us today. Kenneth is going to be speaking about tools within the IDE, the RStudio IDE, and how to use it better. And I think I'm very excited for that. So Kenneth is a senior consultant at Sawtooth Software. And he works on market research surveys, and I'm really excited that he is going to be able to come and share this topic with us. So Kenneth, thank you so much for coming, for preparing this talk, for sharing this info that's going to be, I think, really helpful for so many of us.
Oh, thanks, Julia. Are we ready to get going?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's go for it.
Perfect. All right. So my talk today, we're entitling The Magical RStudio Code Menu. First, just a brief introduction to myself. So name's Kenneth Fairchild. I work as a consultant at Sawtooth Software. I studied statistics at university. Been using R on and off since 2008. Looks like my font's gotten a little out of control. So our Sawtooth Software, essentially, we're a market research software company. So we build survey software that builds out these specialized, they're called Conjoint and max diff exercises. So if you look on the right there, there's an example of what a survey might look like, with the ultimate goal that at the end of it, that we'll be able to make a model that predicts kind of any hypothetical scenario you might want to say. So there I kind of just put that exact scenario back into the simulator and said, what's the probability that they pick any one of these answers? So that's kind of the function of our software. But today I want to talk about RStudio specifically. So if you're like me, you ignore most of what RStudio has to offer. There's buttons everywhere. And if you want to stay sane, you probably ignore most of them most of the time. But the ADD among us, we might wonder, what does that button do? What does that button do? And there's a lot of things you might consider learning about RStudio just by looking at a section, say, what does that do? Why did they put that button there for me? And there's probably a handful of these you use all the time. So I mean, it's a growth mindset question to say, what more does this software have for me that I'm usually ignoring? So rather than take on the whole IDE at once, we're just going to focus on one menu. And this is a menu that I ignored for years. I've used RStudio probably almost the entire time I've used R. But I never really used specifically much of this menu. And once I started playing with the functions in here, I just found them super useful. So we're going to take a deep dive into these. So hopefully at the end, we'll make some of kind of the routine tasks we need to do all the time a little bit easier. Hopefully add some curiosity, saying, what else is RStudio hiding from me? And then, just kind of the hopeful things we can do out of this menu, get more organized, make more readable code faster, get more reusable code, test faster, and just manage better. And then cut off everything you learn is one more thing you don't not know, because I had to get a double negative in there. Okay, so first section, we're going to look at the documentation outline. It's the fourth option down in the code menu. There's actually 3 ways to get to this. And it's just generally an outline of your code. This is automatically generated from the way that you've structured your document. So it may have a lot of sections, it may not have very many, but there's 3 ways to get it. We have this menu drop down, there's a hotkey. So if you remember Control-Shift-O, which you never will, because you can also just click on this button over here, which loads it into it. So from here, we're going to jump right into RStudio and look at some of the kind of document organization tools that we have. So jumping back into RStudio, if we look at this section examples.r, so we can see automatically, if I click this button, it'll open and close this. I could use the document outline, but it's also right there. These are automatically generated. So if I have anything that's identified by RStudio as a section, it will generate them automatically. So you can insert your own new section. You're like, okay, I want this organization. I want to divide my code. You can go into the code menu and say insert section, or Control-Shift-R, and give it a name. Call it my new section. Hit OK. And now we have a new section. It pops up here in the outline, and it will, it's also collapsible. So sections are always collapsible. So you get this, kind of code collapsing function. They're distinguished from a normal comment. A normal comment's not going to be a section. There's not a collapse with a normal comment. Oh, I just lost. Oop, there we go. So a normal comment isn't collapsed into a section. But RStudio has a couple rules it uses to define a section. So what it's looking for when you generate one, it'll fill this whole line with hyphens, but you can use equal signs, hyphens, or pound signs, and as long as there's 4 or more, it'll be a section. So you have example 1, 2, and 3. Get rid of one of those. Example 1 section just disappeared. So practically you could use these for, I don't tend to have a lot of sections in my code, but I'll have something like, I'll put all the functions at the top and say, okay, this is the function section. You give it whatever label. There's some hierarchy to them, especially if you have like functions within functions or sections within functions, or as you get more code, you can see these kind of automatically build. There's not like a easy way to get nested hierarchy outside of functions, but just be aware that it exists. And so that's sections. So next things we have jump to and go to file location. So jump to is essentially has the same function as this side menu. So probably don't need that too much, as long as as long as this is here, or if if you're being extra speedy and want to have the hotkey. But Alt Shift J is a little bit awkward if you look at that on your keyboard. So probably your best bet to navigate is through these. You can also say jump to file function. If you know the name of a function that you have, like, oh, where did I write that out? You can start typing it, and it'll say, okay, I have this function called D that's sitting over in examples 2, and it'll pop me over to my examples 2 function document and say, okay, well, here's D. So you can jump around in that way. Okay. So that's kind of our sections and navigating through sections. Show diagnostics is it'll kind of evaluate your code. If it can tell you're going to have an error before you run it, these will pop up. There's also some other notes that it might show up, and it depends on your settings. We'll go into the settings. So we'll get notes like, F is defined but not used. Argument Z is missing with no default here on line 65. So I define a function that's B, it takes in X, Y, and Z, and I never use B. So it's I never pass in a Z. So it's like, well, why didn't you give me a Z? So it'll just kind of note that. If you want to modify what it shows you with the diagnostics, you go to Tools and then Global Options. And then under the Code menu, there's a Diagnostics tab. And you can kind of dig into this. There's good documentation from RStudio on how these works. But you can have more or less notes. So there's a couple of these I keep off. But if you turn them all on and say, okay, now give me the diagnostics, you get kind of more notes. Like RStudio really wants, if you have an addition sign, it really wants you to put spaces on either side of those. So it kind of has an idea style in mind. So whether you want to adhere to those guidelines or not, you can keep those or not. But those are the diagnostics. The other option, show diagnostics for the project. So I have an R project open, so this will just run diagnostics across all of my files. So it doesn't like a lot of my white space around my bad codes files. For some reason, it doesn't like my bad code. But usually I'll keep those styles off. So I don't use this check usage of arrow function. I warn if variable has no definition in scope ends up bothering me more than it helps me. So an example of that I have down here. If I go and say, okay, source my examples2 file, which literally was just the definition of the D function, then I will get a note here that says, hey, D is not defined in the scope. And I'm like, well, I know it's over in this file that I sourced. So just for me, I don't want that notification. Which leads into one of the next functions, go to function definition. If I see D and I'm like, where on earth did I find D? Again, we had that go to file function, but I can also come here and say go to function definition. So I highlight D and say, I want to know where on earth D was defined. And I click on go to function definition, and it will take me to exactly where D was defined. If you have a lot of code and you have a lot of functions and you're like, okay, I use this function, but I don't remember exactly what it does. I don't remember what the inputs and outputs it's expecting are. This go to function definition will just pop you right to it. And closely related to that, I mean, most of the functions you use are probably not written by yourself. So if you see a function, you're like, well, what does that do? There's a lot of different ways to get to the help documentation. So I guess the first one I learned was you just question mark source if I wanted to know what the source function was or if I wanted to know what the plot was. So you can search for a function in this way. But by far the easiest way that I use almost all the time is you double click to select the function and then hit F1. And it is by far the easiest way to jump to the help documentation. So just getting quick help, I've found that super useful. There's also, there's a lot of other ways to get to the help, which is nice because run into a lot of need for that. Okay, so that covers everything for this section. So feel free to jump in with comments if you want, or I will move on to the next section. Okay, so the next thing is I don't know if it's Roxygen. I want to call it Roxygen. I feel like if you see a name, you should probably use the funnest pronunciation of it. I'm always amused, like if you've ever learned Python, there's a lot of packages in Python where they have a very, very specific pronunciation that they have in mind, and they'll start fights with you if you get it wrong, which is unfortunate because they have some of the funniest packages. If you see the SciPy package and you don't call it Skippy, I just don't know if you love life or not. So we're going to call this the Roxygen skeleton. And the short version.
Maybe before you do on to Roxygen, which is how Hadley says it. So I think you can call it Roxygen.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, yeah. So someone had a question about the go to function definition. When you did that. So like, does it open the file or does it already have to be open?
I think it will jump to it and open it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right.
If it's sourced like this, because it knows that I guess it recalls back to when it was run, and then says, where did I run that from? And so if I say, I guess we could test it. Just close examples too, because it literally only has the one function in it. And if I say go to function definition, yeah, pops it up.
Yep, there it goes. It's open now.
So yeah, I guess that it'll only apply if you're using your own code that you've sourced from a different file. But if that's the case, then I mean, I tend to source files a lot if I want to reuse code, but I haven't packaged it yet.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah, that's also my experience. Awesome. Okay. On to Roxygen.
Okay, so we're not going to go too deep into this because honestly, this could be its own presentation. So Roxygen is geared around if you were writing your own package. And this just makes it super easy to do the documentation. You can do the documentation in another way that I don't remember the name of, but this is a way to kind of integrate the documentation right with your code. It automatically compiles into the code you meant. So when you say go build my package, it just builds the documentation. So this example I made just kind of a calculate my stuff function. And then when I put it into a package, it built out the documentation for me. So if I wrote my own package, then I could have my own help documentation that goes with it. It says, this is how to use it. Here's what it takes in. Here's what it spits out. And I guess old me used to think, writing my own R package, that's a really intimidating thing. But it's super useful if you're going to be reusing similar code. Like if you're in the same environment doing the same kind of problems and you reuse code over and over again, rather than like, so I work as a consultant. So my old system, go find a similar old project and copy my code into the new project. It's just so much easier to just package like, oh, I need to do this same data transformation. I need to do this same analysis over and over and over again. It's just so much easier to package it into a reusable format. And R packages are great for that. I've included, when you get these slides, there's 2 really good tutorials I found, and then there's an entire book sitting out there on writing R packages. Like there's no end to the resources there, but we'll just leave it at that for now. And so this is the section I'm most excited about, cleaning and reusing code. These next few functions are so useful, and they've changed the way that I write code. Just some notes on cleaning code. Some of the notes, alignment of code, just making it readable is a really big deal. If you have a really long line, which old me really loved to write long, confusing lines of code and say, look how smart I am. And then future me's thinks that I'm a jerk for writing awful code like that. But with these tools, it's really easy to kind of go split those apart again and turn old bad code into good code, which we'll run through some examples. And then reusable code it's all about abstracting. So if you have a specific problem doing a specific thing, you want to make it general. So going from arithmetic to algebra is an abstraction on, what does it generally mean to add things together? And then, if you have a specific thing, I wanted to draw, this particular bar chart, and well, now I want to abstract that to draw any similar bar chart. So we'll go through the.
Yeah, maybe. So you're about to talk about reusing code.
Yeah,
And so there's a really great question here, kind of as we were talking about sourcing and Roxygen and package. What are the benefits, costs of going all the way to a package versus sourcing, like things that are in a file? So when do you do it? What are the benefits of it?
sure.
Yeah.
The moment you have more than one person involved, I'd say a package starts to make a lot of sense. If it's literally, I want this as lightweight as possible, I just want to carry it from project to project, and I have the same general functions that I want to use, you may not get the full benefits of doing a package at that point, because if it's not overly complicated and it's part of your workflow and you're doing it all the time, you're ultra familiar with it, I'd say, sourcing's fine. If you have a chance that you might forget this between now and the next time you need to reuse it, having your own documentation written out, which you probably should do in comments in front of your functions anyway, but throwing it in a package with documentation can be really help either someone else or future you. Could be, you in the future might be your client, and it's sometimes hard to tell. And they're also, you need to have an idea of, what is my expectation of how much I need to reuse this code? Because if it's a little bit, then, maybe sourcing's fine. If it's like, I'm going to use this, 100 more times in my career, probably put it in a package.
I think that's a great perspective.
Okay, so put together some cleaning code examples. So we have a lot of functions here. So we have things from pulling out variables and functions, rename in scope. That's one I'll throw an example in, but that's been really useful. Like I'll start out writing code and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to call this letter A because I don't know how much I'm going to use it. And then all of a sudden it's really an integral part of my code. I'm like, I need to stop calling it A before things get out of hand. But I can go rename all the A's all at once to something. But another circumstance, I just start writing a line of code and I don't know how long it is before it's gotten way out of hand. So if I take this super long mess of code that's, especially if you're in the tidyverse doing these piping functions, you end up with really, really long lines of code if you're not mindful of it. So if I go here and I say reformat code, it kind of, it'll follow all of the RStudio's internal spacing guidelines, and things that are, a lot of like functions with a lot of arguments, it'll automatically put them onto new rows. It doesn't do everything I might think about. Like I tend to like all my piped functions on separate lines. So after every pipe, I'll usually put another enter in. But with, if you remember the command, or you just remember that it's here, reformat code, Control-Shift-A, you can go clean up a lot of code really fast. Take something absolutely gross and say, okay, now it's just this function followed, piped into this function, piped into this pivot, and all of a sudden it looks a lot better. And this is an example from just the other day, so it's nice to just be able to re-clean that up. The next ones, I have two of every one, so we can see like kind of a before and after on cleaning up some of these codes. Looking at extract variable. So it's really easy. Like, you find a file, like, okay, just go read that file. But if I wanted to go reuse this at any point, then I can go select this entire string and say, I want to pull this out into a variable. And I'll just call this file name. And it will automatically pull the string out, assign it to a value, and then put my variable in place of where I had selected. So it just puts it on the previous line. It's super handy. And then if I need, later on, I'm going to pull it in as a CSV, but when I export it, it's going to be, say, Excel format. Then I can just reuse file name. I don't have to go, find out where it was. It's, I have to actually run the code. But so I can spit out a new modified version of it. So if anything, if I'm ever going to reuse it ever again, then I might think about pulling those variables out. Also, if I get a really gross line of code, maybe it makes sense to build it out in pieces and use extract variable to clean that up. The next one, extract function. So I just built this simple thing. It samples, letters A through E, the first 5 letters, grabs 1,000 of them with some probabilities, and then throws them into the table function. So I just get a count of how often did each letter come out. But say I wanted to reuse this code for whatever reason. The things I might want to say is like, okay, well, maybe I have more letters than one. I'm just going to call that K. And instead of 1,000, I'm going to call this N. And then my probabilities are also going to be K. And now that I've kind of swapped out all the magic numbers with variables, I can go and say, okay, I'm going to extract this into a function. I'm going to call this sample letters. And RStudio will automatically build this function out for me. And there's things like, the letters is like a global constant, so I don't need that. Table is a function that's part of the base package. I'll just assume that it knows what table is. And now I have a function that can sample letters. So if I want to sample the first 10 letters and I want 10,000 of them, then it throws me an error. Please. Whatever. So this not a lesson on coding, but just kind of the idea of abstracting a function.
If you want to show us, it just has to be sample letters.
Oh, sample letters of 10,000. There, sorry. It's hard to think and code at the same time.
100%.
And talk and think and code.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so you can quickly go from, I have code that does what I want to now I have a function that executes the code that I want. Another example, this was just from the other day. I was building, it's kind of these partition counts. Like I wanted every permutation of things in 4 groups that summed to 8, but I didn't need every permutation of them. So this function is of the partition package just did that. But this was specifically for 8 and 4, so it's same idea. I can abstract this to call them K and D, extract function. What do I want to call this? Count permutations. And again, it throws in maybe things that I don't care about. Like I really only need K and D. I don't need all my functions. I can give these defaults if I want. So you take what it gives you, you clean it up a little bit, and then you have a working function based on your code. You can do it on whole blocks of code too. So I built kind of a play example of, you give it some inputs and it's going to run just a simple simulation. You pick a slope and a standard deviation. It generates some random normal data for your X variables, adds an error to the X's based on your standard deviation, and multiplies all your X's by your slope, adds the error, and that's your Y's, puts them into a data frame, and then throws them into a ggplot. So if I just run that, now I have a working simulation. But if I say, hey, I want to be able to do this generally, I don't want to have to like tweak my inputs. Again, go to code, extract function, call this simulate line. I don't need to pass in the LM function. I might want slope in front of standard deviation. And I can give all these defaults. And then I can go run that over and over again, which conveniently, if you look in the code menu, there is a rerun previous. So if I have something random and I just want to keep running it over and over again, I can hit Control-Shift-P. So we have a function for that too. Okay. So we did extract function, extract variable. Just wanted to quickly clean up some old code. So reformat code, just Control-Shift-A can clean up old code. Like this one was specifically like, hey, this looks really, really bad because it's just this long GG save thing. But if I hit Control-Shift-A on that line, it's actually not that bad. It's just that GG save takes in a lot of parameters. And if I said, hey, maybe, I mean, this isn't clear what this is, but it's, it's building out a file name. So I can also say, go pull this out, call it file name. It doesn't put it outside of the GG save. So I have to go grab this and put it out here. But now I've kind of cleaned up my code. So GG save is going to take in a file name. Like, I can think later what file name should be, but I've pulled it away. So it's not a bunch of code within code within code. And now that that's swapped out, this is kind of messed up, which we can use this reindent lines function. In this case, it's simple. I just, go in front of file name, hit tab. But if your code has gotten more messed up, you can go reindent lines and clean that up. Or if I said, hey, I want this isn't the type of function, but I want to go save this as, something to save. Sometimes that'll mess up your whole line. You want to go reindent it. Okay. Most of these are just being mindful of time. There's a lot of examples we could go into here. This one's more of a data slicing problem. So if I want to clean this one up, probably the best thing to do is go in and grab these and say, let's pull out a variable and call this the row slice. And then go into the last part and say, extract variable. This is the column slice. And all of a sudden, my really old, terrible code, it's a lot more easy to parse now. And I'd probably even go through and line up these because if things are similar or in an order, I think it looks better to line up the arrows. But now I can say, okay, before it was this big mess of, how do I pull out from this raw data? And now it's a little bit cleaner. And I mean, nowadays I'd probably use tidy for this, but this is just picking up old code. There's another one of those magic crazy lines of, function into function into function. And if there's a function already like this, we wouldn't use extract function. We say, extract variable. And this is my, what's a string split? Call it the splitting function. And then, fundamentally, I'm saying what things are in this big mess. So go grab that and call that its own variable and say, this is my include list. And so I can just start to clean up code. I take code that was absolutely just unusable in its old form. And this was probably just something like I wanted to look at my data in some format. But if I want to say, what does my code do at all? Then, when it comes down to, like, I'm saying what things are not included in this include list out of the max diff list. It's just so much easier to read this code. And these kind of variable and function extractors just make it so much easier to clean that up. We'll skip the last example. This is just an example of reindent lines. So I just took a bunch of random things and they're all misaligned. I think it's Control-I. It just cleans them up. Just really quick, easy thing. If I go and say, hey, these are my random nums, Alt hyphen is the shortcut for the arrow function. So if you want to save yourself a tiny amount of time, Alt hyphen gives you an arrow function. But now my indentation's messed up again. So I come back here, Control-I, and it fixes it for me again. So just really easy to keep your code looking clean and just quickly update it. Okay, so that's cleaning, reusing code. Those things have like massively changed the way I code, and it's so much easier to clean things up with those functions. Sure we didn't miss anything up to this point. Oh, there's a couple of these functions on comments. I built just a dummy example of comments. So the comment hotkey, and it's probably just best to memorize this so you can quickly do this. You're like, hey, I want to run my code, but I don't want to run this line. So Control-Shift-C quickly comments and end comments things. And then this one I use a lot less, but if your comment ends up a giant lorem ipsum line, then you can say reflow comment, and it will split your comment into more bite-sized pieces. So if you're commenting something that gets way too long, you can have it automatically reformat it for you, so you don't have to do that yourself. Okay. So the next ones are all on running code. So there's a lot of these here, and it's probably not practical to remember all these hotkeys. Run selected line is probably my go-to for all my code. If I want to run, especially if I want, I have this function, it just plots a sine wave. If I want to say, what does just one part of this look like? What am I feeding into the sine function? I select that and say Control Enter, and it'll say, okay, this is just the things that are, the numbers 1 through 200 divided by 4 pi, and that's all I'm getting out of it. And so if I want to look at, what is this exact part of the code doing, especially if something's breaking, you want to like see what part of it's breaking, you can run it in pieces and say, does this part work? Does this part work? And then kind of diagnose code in that way. So Control Enter, if you're not running code in that way, I would highly recommend running a lot of your code. We already did rerun previous, which occasionally is helpful. Another one I use from time to time is run from the beginning until this point. So if I'm building out code and I break something in the middle and I want to kind of rerun it fresh, usually at the beginning of my code, I'll have like, clear the environment and start over, make sure everything works. I might say, okay, up to this point, does everything work? You hit Control-Alt-B or run this. Or if you've changed the beginning part, you want to say, okay, I want to see my result, run everything else. Run function definition. If you're highlighting a function, you can just say, just run this function. Code section, I've literally never run code section, but back to our sections right at the beginning, if you have a division of your code, it'll just run that division. And then occasionally Control-Alt-R to run everything. So those are lots of different options. This whole section of the menu changes. Like if you're in like an R presentation that the slides are based off of, you get a couple different options here. So it is somewhat contextual to the type of file that you're in. So those are running code. So generally Control-Enter is your best friend. And you might look at the other ones, or just know that other options might exist if you're looking to do something special with your code running. The last couple things I know a lot less about, so we'll do a lot more glossing over them. The terminal section, if you want to do anything kind of on a system level, you can use the terminal. It also pops up down here. So if you want to write, give me the things in my directory, you can write commands down here and it will output that for you. And then the last section is the different sourcing options. So you can say, I want to use this file as a, just straight up run the file and grab the whole file, run all the code in the file. It'll give you the whole document path. So if you want to reuse that code, I can go copy this, say, hey, I want to use this somewhere else. I probably have this in an R package, so an R project. So I'm just gonna, cut the path to the end. But if you want to source a file, you can do that. Usually I'll just write the function out directly, just, source or, yeah. And then source with echo, just read the whole file and spit out everything you read, also put it in the console. So if I source this file, it's going to run all the code is also going to spit it into the console. And then if you want to go grab a different file, this one actually might be useful. Like, hey, I want to include all the code from examples 2. It'll pull in all the code for examples 2, but it'll also throw this to the console. So if I wanted to do that every time, I could go grab that code, cut off the whole file path, and then I have a link to that file. Usually I'll just write the function out myself though, so I don't usually use those buttons at all. So that's the end of the code menu. It's kind of a deep dive into those functionalities, and there's a lot more menus that we could dive into, and even some of them I was looking through, I'm like, what on earth is profile? And I just started looking into profile. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's really cool. I might want to use that someday. So just getting curious and saying, what are all these buttons? What are all these menus? And a good place to start being like, what are the like big skill sets that people build up? There's this link to the RStudio cheat sheets. It's also available in the help menu. So if you just go to help and then cheat sheets, there's the most common ones, and you can go to the RStudio's cheat sheet page, which is where that links to. There's so much to learn, and there's ways to be more efficient. There's tools that you may not be using that could be life-changing. Like, it was only like 2-3 years ago that I started using tidyverse. I saw a presentation from Mark Dotson, which I think I saw him in the chat, and I was super skeptical. I'm like, do I really want to relearn how I code in R? But after using it for a while, I'm like, I can't live without this. This is the best thing ever. Oh, I see Mark there. So that was awesome. So it's like I wasn't really aware of it, and then I learned it, and so there's just so many things to learn in R, and there's so much more power that you can get as a programmer. So hopefully this was helpful, and you can keep growing your skill set. So stop it for questions, and there's my contact information.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kenneth. That was really, really cool. And there was stuff in there that I was like, oh my gosh, I've never done that before. And I'm going to start doing that. Like some of the stuff about extraction, I was like, why have I never done this?
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's so easy. You're like, oh, well, why don't I just I'm going to copy this out, and I'm going to give it a variable name, and then I'm going to go back in here and call
I
it.
was like, oh gosh, that's so great. I need to start doing that.
Yeah.
And that whole section, when you were talking, I was so struck by how after you did those and you like kind of showed the before and afters, how much more readable, maintainable, like just how much better you were making life for yourself, for your coworkers and collaborators. You like just how much better the code was after you did, just made those simple.
Well, yeah, this was one of those things, like you can go years and years in R and not even know these exist because you don't need them. I mean, fundamentally, you can get by without all of these, but once you know them, everything's so much easier.
Yeah. So there were a couple of questions about like R Markdown versus R scripts. And it sounds like maybe you use R scripts more than R Markdown. Is that?
I've only in the last like couple months even used R Markdown at all.
Okay.
So it's a new thing for me.
Yeah. So I use R Markdown a ton, and then if I'm writing an R script, it's probably in a package. Like I'm probably writing an R script in a package, and almost most of what you talked about here works in R Markdown as well as in a .r file. So that's really great. That there's a lot of parity in the features there. And like of the stuff that so I'm about to ask you a question. The stuff that you talked about, the stuff that I feel like I use the most today as of today, and that I've had the biggest impact in my like sort of coding fluency are like the shortcuts for like running like the current row, like running the current, or I'm sorry, running your current line and like
Yeah.
running that to the console, or running, in our markdown, there's one for like running the current chunk, like you just run the current chunk, like all just with one shortcut. And uh and then re-indenting. So I do a lot of that. Like I do a lot of like control A, control I, control A, control I, control A, like as I'm
Yeah.
like just like re-indent my whole file that I'm working on as I'm doing it. So I was wondering, of the stuff that you showed today, what do you feel like you either use the most, or you feel like has had the biggest payoff?
So the reformat code, Control Shift A, I use that all the time. Especially you start writing out these codes, you're like, oh, I need to do this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and it's like, now I have so much packed into one. And especially once you get into tidyverse stuff, and you're pipe this into this, into this, into this, like you probably do a carriage return after each function, but at some point you're like, should this, we have one here, like this GG save, like you start writing it out, you're like, okay, this is manageable, it's manageable, okay, this is way too long.
Yeah.
And so Control Shift A just absolutely saves you. I use, so go to help, knowing that the F1 button works, like different software packages make dramatic different uses of the F1 button. Like Excel, you hit F1, it goes to the generic help documentation. It's not all that helpful, because like, well, I really want help for exactly the thing I'm doing right now. And so being able to just select any function and say, what does GG save do? And I hit F1 and it pops up the documentation. I use that all the time. I used to always, type it in the console and just say, give me GG save. So that's been super helpful.
Yeah.
And then various things about running code, run selected code is really not handy.
Yeah.
And then run from beginning to line if I want to like, test a whole chunk up to like, does it work to this point? Does it work to this point?
Yeah. Nice. Okay, that's really interesting. So there's a question. So if you had a situation where you were, let's see, you wanted to extract a variable, like there was a thing, you had done it, you had, there's this like sort of long thing, and you're like, I need to make that a variable. But let's say you had used it multiple times, like you were writing a script and you were like, okay, I've got this thing, it's like 5 places in my code. What would you do to like extract it out? Like what steps would you take to extract it out, and then replace it?
What
would be an
I just
efficient way to
use
do
find
that?
and replaced at that point.
Yeah, okay.
Because I used to do that a lot with file names, and like, oh, I'll just read it from here, read it in this way, and I'll just copy the file name, and then all of a sudden it's in my code 3 times, and I'm like, probably should have just been a variable the whole time.
Yeah. So you'd probably
So
just find and replace for that?
find and replace. I mean, if it's not too bad, I might just do it manually, because if it's only 2-3 times, maybe it's not so big a deal. And I didn't show an example of it, but using, if you have named something, that rename in scope function is super handy if you have a variable and you're like, okay, this variable name just isn't working for me anymore.
Right.
Like I need it to be something better.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Awesome. Okay. I think the extract a variable, like extract. Yeah. Okay. That last question, I don't think you can extract a variable if you've got multiple things. You would have, like, you do it one time and then you could do find and replace, I think. So I don't think it would work. To Sean's question down there, I don't think it would work with, unfortunately, I don't think it would work with multiple cursors.
Yeah,
I
don't know everything you can do with multiple cursors, so I don't know if there's a clever way. I know you can select like multiple rows and edit a whole row at a time.
Yeah. I don't think it would work though with like the extract variable. Nice. Okay. So anybody else have a question as we wrap up? All right. I did see a question about we're recording this. Do we plan to post it? And we do plan to post it, barring any technical problems. We will plan to post this on our YouTube channel. So you can find that from our GitHub page or our Meetup page. So you can look for that or share it with folks if you think they would think it's interesting. So there. So again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Kenneth, for that really fantastic presentation. I think is super practically interesting and really will help us a lot. Next month, remember on April 8th, 7th, we're having our next meetup, and I'll drop the link here that you can see that, and we hope that you can join us then. And yeah, you can look for our next meetings after that. And I think that wraps it up for us. Oh, I guess I will say, if you are interested in, if you have an idea for a talk that you're interested in giving, maybe like later, like into the summer or even into the fall, maybe, please do reach out to me or Mark or Andrew. We would love to hear from you. And if you have got any other questions, please also reach out. So thank you again so much for coming, and we will see you next time.
Great. Thank you.